Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the UK Hospitality General Election webinar. Half the world is going to be voting in 2024 one way or another, 2/3 of the world's GDP. And on the 4th of July, many of us in the UK have the second shot at it in, what will it be, 2 months, 3 months, something like that, between the May election and this. It came as a surprise to lots of us, but not to Kate. Kate, I hope you don't mind me telling this anecdote, but the Friday before the election was called, you came to me in our staff canteen and said, I can't tell you why, but they're calling an election next week. I'm pretty certain. And I'll be honest, as an inveterate listener of Centrist Dad podcasts, I thought to myself, no. And I didn't tell anyone. But you were right. You won a certain amount of money, and here we are. So hopefully that gives you some confidence that the team you're hearing from today are good people to listen to about this topic. We thought it'd be a good idea to take time with our members to talk about the politics, the policy, and what it might mean for your business. We have some slides to go through, and we want to have a good half hour for Q&A. So please feel free to add any questions that you want to put to us in the chat as we go, and our colleague David will MC a Q&A afterwards. If you go on to the next slide. These are your speakers. You've got Kate Nichols, our brilliant CEO and one of the most connected people in Westminster, and me, Alan, who is your new Deputy CEO here at UK Hospitality. But what are we going to talk about? Well, I suppose 5 things, really. The polls, what might happen? Can we predict what the outcome of the election might be? The economic battleground, what are the parties going to be arguing and disagreeing about over the next few weeks? Parliamentary wash-up, or in less technical terms, what did the government manage to squeeze through before the end of the parliamentary term and the calling of the election? And then a specific deep dive into Labour's policy. Because, of course, a Labour win would be the change. So we want to pause to think about what that change might mean for us as a sector. And then finally, to let you know how we are using the election, how we're supporting you, and how we want to help you raise your own voices too. But first, let's start with the polls. Kate, I don't know if you're going to tell people how much you won in your bet, but over to you.
I'll leave that for people to ask in the Q&A. And for the avoidance of doubt, I had no insider knowledge. It was just simply the feel that I got. It wasn't that anybody had told me, and that I knew it was coming from that reason. It was just intel, insight, and what I felt. I just wanted to pick up on Alan's last point, though, as to why we're taking the time to do this now today and take people through, not just because it's quite interesting in and of itself, but also more importantly, it's about what it might mean commercially and operationally for businesses over the course of the next year, and particularly from that commercial perspective about confidence, returning consumer confidence, returning business confidence, and better investment climate. And also Alan's last point there on the slide about how we are going to use this election, it's to reassure people that we are extremely well prepared. We have been working hard on this as a team in UK Hospitality for a change in government, because whoever wins, whether it's Labour or Conservative, and we can come on and touch on the other alternatives, but whoever wins, we are going to have a new government. You've got so many MPs standing down that whoever comes in, it is not going to be the same government that we've got now. It is going to be different. Therefore, the team at UK Hospitality has been working through an iterative process for the whole of this year, since September, when we launched our manifestos at the party conferences as to what we wanted from the political parties coming in. We've been waiting to implement this. We're implementing it slightly earlier, but we have a well-oiled machine that will go to make sure that that strategic direction that we're looking at, whoever comes in, we're well placed, and we are well placed with relationships across all the major parties. And so we've just put into practice a strategic plan that we've had for some time to make sure that whatever happens, our hospitality businesses are heard and understood. The new government has taken account of our agenda that we set out in our manifestos. And then this next phase is about what we want to see as an agenda for that new government. And that's what we're going to come on and talk about. So the key purpose, really, we have a plan, we've prepared it, we're implementing it as to whoever comes in. And the reason that we're going to talk quite a bit in this webinar about the Labour Party is this poll that you've got sitting in front, and that what you can see going into this election is that you are still predicting a Labour win despite all the changes that we've got. This is the poll of polls. It picks up all the polling that goes through. Polls vary. There is a margin of error in all of them. But you can see here the poll of polls looking at that percentage vote share, and then looking at what it might mean when you project it onto seats. And you've got the slide there that looks at that. When you look at the spread over the course of the last 6 to 9 months, you're looking at a spread around Labour of a 40 to 50 percentage points percent of the vote share. Conservatives 19 to 29, Lib Dems 6 to 12, Reform 8 to 14. So you can see in the smaller parties, that's where you're getting the broadest spread and the broadest unpredictability of seats that comes through on the back of it. And the message of that poll of polls is that you've got pretty flatlining levels of support for Labour and Conservative. What this doesn't show is the don't knows, and they are roughly around a third of people who are polled in any of these polls say that they don't know how they are going to vote, and I think genuinely don't know how they are going to vote. And the big uncertainty and why you get these wildly fluctuating numbers of what seats might turn out as a result of that is simply because people don't know what's going to happen. And I think my gut is a lot of those people who say they don't know or none of the above will actually choose not to turn out and vote. And the spread of seats, you've got that midpoint there, which is shown by the YouGov poll. Again, there is quite a wide spread. You've had estimates of 460 Labour seats down to as low as 390, Conservatives below 100 and up to 185. And then, as I say, if you look at the smaller parties, Lib Dems anywhere between 22 and 50 seats, SNP 19 to 41. And I think this election will be determined largely, as the size of the majority will be determined by what happens in Scotland, Wales, and some of those other areas. But as you can see, you've got that sort of range and spread. Not all of the polls are as positive. And if we go into the next slide, you can see that since the election has been called, you've got one poll that has come out, which is a new methodology, tries to determine what happens if those don't knows do go ahead and vote, and tries to predict it differently. But this is the poll that came out just this week after the election called, showing Labour only 12 points ahead. A couple of interesting points here. Even if you strip out the methodology, which is quite new and quite different, using a machine learning program, using AI to predict what will happen to those people who say they don't know how they're going to vote yet, even if you strip that out, it only shows Labour 17 percentage points ahead. Lots of polling people and lots of commentators will talk about percent ahead. It's not, it's percentage points. That dramatically reduces the likely size of that Labour majority. And the interesting point here is that that gap is 10 percentage points for men, 27 percentage points for women, which shows that the Labour Party has quite a lead amongst the female contingent. I've heard talks about Whitby woman being the deciding factor as to what happens with that. But there's a sort of female point that is to be taken into account. But that would show still a Labour majority government. It would show the Conservative Party a higher vote share than we've seen, and a higher percentage of seats. I still think that for the Conservative Party, getting 200 seats would be a good result, but you can see that they are short of a majority if you look at those local election results. But we actually, on that, although we've put it on that side, we don't think that that is a good mapper to suggest that there is any likelihood of a hung parliament. That slide, based on the local election results, doesn't take account of the fact that there were large chunks of the country, notably Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, that weren't voting and will be voting this time around. And as we've shown, depending on what happens at the lower end of the market, with the sort of smaller parties, will have a big determinant on a Labour majority. So we're still forecasting a Labour majority coming through. And from a business perspective, this is not a party political point. This is a sort of business confidence, stability, certainty point. Whoever forms the next government, the best result for the business community is for there to be a stable government that has a large majority or a large-ish majority and avoids being pulled to the extremes. Businesses need to have the certainty and stability that messages and policies that are announced will stick and won't be subject to biting at the sides. And when Alan comes to talk about the Labour Party manifesto that we anticipate being published, and we are focusing on the Labour Party because that's the only one that has got any outlined policies out there in the market at the moment. We will come back to the others when we get the manifestos later in the campaign, probably in the next couple of weeks. But at the moment, the Labour Party manifesto is there. If we look at a Labour government coming in based on this polling, you want to have a Labour government that has a strong enough majority to withstand nibbling at the edges from fringe parties or opposition, so that we have clarity and certainty around our planning. So that's what the polls are telling us. That's the framing for why we are talking to you today about the Labour policies and a potentially Labour government, because that is still the most likely outcome. But I'm sure we can come back to that on questions. If we move now to the final bit from me, just the economic battleground. Again, this is not just a sort of esoteric discussion. I think this will be critical for our sector in particular, because we depend on that magical elixir of consumer confidence, and it's going to take a bit of a battering over the next 4 to 5 weeks, because you have two very different narratives that are coming out in the economic background that we're seeing. If we take first the case for the Conservative Party, the economic arguments that will dominate, largely this was called, very snap election, called on the basis of one good set of results on inflation, and a sense that unlike the Dee Ream song in 1997, things probably couldn't get any better, but were only likely to get worse, not just economically, but also more generally. And that's the case that the Labour Party will be putting out. But what you've got here is close to the Bank of England target of 2% for the first time in over 2 years. UK's seen bigger price rises, though, than any G7 country, and there'll be a lag in that inflation figure feeding through into our price inflation that we're feeling in businesses. But there is also the danger flagged by the Bank of England that lag on wages, national living wage and cost pressures in April might mean that inflation figure fluctuates. But we've got good news here. And that's what we desperately want, is a positive economic story. So helpful for us to have the message coming out of government that the economy is going gangbusters, I think was what the Prime Minister said the day after the election was called. Growth up, wages up. Forecasts for a deep recession never came to pass. Inflation vanquished, although energy is doing a lot of the heavy lifting there, and there is a suspicion that energy prices may well go up in October. But wages are rising in real terms, and as you can see here, better economic growth in 1 quarter than the rest of the G7. If we go to the next slide, this is where I fear that economic battleground taking to the centre stage will not necessarily be good for us in this crucial period in running into the summer season. The case for the opposition is inflation down, but prices are up, and the economic battleground is that the economy is flatlining, not necessarily good. And they'll be taking obviously a 14-year look, not a 1 quarter look. Worse record on over the cost of living crisis than any of the other G7. And the message that you're getting, a very Gen Z message, we're being gaslit. Defence in by the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves ahead of the early general election call. You may see the economy improving, you may see inflation coming down, but taxes and mortgages are still going up. And unfortunately for the government, you're not going to see those successive cuts in the Bank of England interest rates coming through before what would have been a likely November election. So you're probably not going to see the Bank of England touch interest rates until the autumn. And then the final point that the Labour Party will make is real disposable incomes are down. You've never had it so bad, which again, not helpful from us and from our perspective. So we will be trying to talk up the economic forecasts and the economic activity. Just a couple of dates for the diary in the economic battleground that we'll see. Bank of England meeting 20th of June. Think it's highly unlikely that they will make any big significant announcements around the Monetary Policy Committee, given that we will be in the final week of an an election. But then Friday, the 28th of June, we have ONS data coming out on family incomes. And critically, will they be higher or lower than when Boris Johnson came to power? Do you feel that you're better off is going to be the key message that both parties will be pushing forward in the last week of the campaign. So before that, there is a lot of issues that they will want to be talking about more generally. And I think the final slide I've got is sort of what has happened in the last couple of weeks that we've had this parliament. You can move to the next slide, don't worry. What's called parliamentary wash up, the tidying up and dotting I's, crossing T's. Parliament actually wasn't officially dissolved and prorogued and ended until Thursday, which is when all MPs stopped being MPs. Ministers still continued to be ministers, so we still have a government. But it was only yesterday that you had that final bit of Parliament, and you get legislation that falls by the wayside or is put into temporary abeyance, into a deep freeze, and you get measures that go through. The ones that have been confirmed, the tipping code of practice into legislation, we still need the enacting legislation on 1st of October, but we don't think that that date will change. And we assume that when new ministers come in on the 5th of July, 8th of July, when they return, top of their intro will be signing that off, and you will still have that coming in. But the code of practice and the draft legislation is now finalised, so you can plan on that basis. Extended hours for the Euros, that came through, as did tweaks on pavement licensing, and the team has detailed briefings that you can find on our website. And then finally, digital marketing bill, that was agreed. It covers online reviews, regulation of digital platforms, drip pricing. That will be picked up. It's in force, but a lot of the implementation will be left. The one bit then that is uncertain for us, we have a national living wage consultation out at the moment with the Low Pay Commission that will spread throughout the election campaign. The remit at the moment set by the Conservative Party was that it should be to maintain the bite at 66% median earnings for the national living wage, 50% median average earnings for the minimum wage, and should just stick at 21, not taking it to a wider range of workers. That's what they're working towards. And the report that they will make, they will conclude their evidence in July and report to ministers. But clearly you're reporting to new ministers. Now, there is no guarantee, but it looks as though that remit will be maintained and they will report on that remit. But we wait to see what happens when you get new ministers coming in and making decisions in the first budget that you will see post a general election. Whichever party comes in, you will have within the first 100 days a budget coming through, and it remains to be seen what they do around that. If that remit is stuck to, you're looking at national living wage of around between 2 and 5% increases is what the forecasts are, but we can't plan. And obviously we don't know also what's happening on business rates coming forward in April 2025. On the other side, things that they're not lost because they will be returned to, but there weren't issues that were taken forward and finally confirmed ahead of the end of Parliament. Big ones being the packaging laws, deposit return schemes, EPR, which is due to be enforced from 1st of January. Still don't know the details of that. Martin's Law, that will be picked up and taken forward, but it was anticipated it would be further into the implementation period by the end of the Parliament, and we don't have that taken forward. And again, short-term letting licensing tweaks, we anticipate those will be picked up, and the team is on the case to make sure that the changes we need are taken forward, as well as the bigger issues. Again, one bit that did fall by the wayside and remains to be seen whether Labour will pick it back up again is the obvious smoking ban, and the change in legislation that was going to eliminate the ability to buy cigarettes for a younger age gap. The watch out with that clearly being that that will see a big focus of public health coming through with a new incoming Labour government, and likelihood that they will pick back up issues to do with smoking, obesity, and broader public health agenda. I'm going to hand over to Alan now, who is going to then talk through, as I say, because of the framing, because of what the polls are saying, our work has been very much focused on making sure we have a good, close relationship with the shadow opposition team. So the remainder of what we're focusing on is primarily around Labour's policies as they are announced at the moment, because there are some that are further developed than we've seen coming through from the manifesto from the Conservative Party. And I'm going to hand over to Alan, who's going to talk to you about that.
Thank you, Kate. So yes, let's move on to the so what. What would a Labour government mean? And in some ways, because of the charts that Kate's shared, the reality of the UK finances mean that there may not be significant change across the board as we change governments. Whoever wins on the 4th of July will have relatively little room for investment. But there are certainly areas where Labour is setting out detail. There are very high profile things like their investment in green economy and in green energy. But for the purposes of this group, there's things like business rates, where they're promising a full review to address the inequalities in the system, which mean that a hotel pays 3 times as much of their revenues in business rates as a big bank does, and to bring certainty about what a business rates multiplier might be in the long run. And on the apprenticeship levy, where they're calling for a review to introduce a new skills and growth levy, where half of the levy could be spent on non-apprenticeship training. Both of those are big wins for the UK hospitality family, including the team here at UK Hospitality, but also our members. But today I want to focus on the New Deal for working people. We've been working really hard with the party on this in not just in recent weeks, but over many months. And there's 4 parts of it in particular that I wanted to share where they are and where they've come from. So first of all, a genuine living wage. They are proposing a change to the Low Pay Commission's remit to take into account the cost of living alongside the continuing remit around median wage and economic conditions. Now, you'll notice there's real flexibility in that language. Clearly, a cost of living may be higher than the current median wage percentage. It may not be. In private conversations with the Labour Party, they've talked about holding the median wage level rather than growing it. But there is flexibility in that language, and we need to stay close to them to help them think through the way that they may think about the Low Pay Commission's remit. On 0-hour contracts, there has been significant change here. They've moved from initially thinking about needing to ban flexible working entirely to recognizing that actually for a lot of people, flexible working is incredibly important around their caring responsibilities or their education or just their lifestyle. So instead, they've moved to giving everyone the rights to a contract that reflects the number of hours they regularly work based on a 12-week reference period. But crucially, the employee doesn't need to accept that. So we're not going to be in a position where your staff are banned from the workplace unless they can guarantee set hours. So that feels like a pro-business, pro-employer change that we've been working very hard with them on. Thirdly, collective bargaining. This is the idea of union-led fair pay agreements at sector level for some parts of the economy, and they want to start with social care, where, of course, the end client in most instances in the state. They are now explicitly saying that they don't want collective bargaining in every sector. And we've been given private confidences that they accept hospitality as unlikely to work for collective bargaining. Because, Kate, you and I did some sort of back of a fag packet maths on this, where we were sort of working out how many different bargains you would need. And by the time you've thought about geographical spread and you've thought about different sorts of roles, you've thought about different ends of the market, you'd need over 70 individual collective bargaining agreements. So it's simply not practicable, and we feel that Labour understand that. And then finally, day one rights. The word basic has been introduced in the last few weeks by Labour, and they're now talking in a more limited way about unfair dismissal, parental leave, and sick pay quite specifically, and there will still be probation periods. So fair dismissal and probation periods are still very much allowed. And that again is quite a change from where they were initially. And I think we would feel that Labour have thought about how to apply the principles in a way which supports job creation. But we will clearly need to stay very close to the detail of this, not just through this campaign, but into a potential Labour government. So moving on to how we are using the election, I think it's important to restate what Kate said, that this is a continuation of a lot of hard work during the pandemic, since the pandemic, to argue for the sector. We have had our policy asked with the major parties across the UK for many months now, and we have seen significant wins with things like business rates and apprenticeships clearly being policy for the coming parliament for the major parties. For us, though, an election is a chance to set the stage for a pro-hospitality parliament. It's about showing incoming MPs how hospitality creates places where people want to live, work and invest, and how we as a sector can be at the heart of a new parliament's ambitions for good growth. There are going to be more new MPs this time round than in any recent election, and we need to make sure that they hear from us before they turn up in Westminster. So how are we doing that? Well, look, we're promoting the sector's value and we're thinking about it in terms of recruiting supporters for the next parliament. We are sending information to every candidate across the UK via the clever tools that we have, and we are engaging directly with the key ones, particularly people who themselves have a background in hospitality or represent very hospitality rich seats, or we expect to have senior roles. We'll be arranging visits for key candidates to our member firms to go and see your premises and see the great work that you all do. But equally importantly, we do see ourselves as a platform to support your voice. And we will be supporting members to contact candidates directly, including tools which allow you to create bespoke letters to your local candidates and MPs that reflects the detail of your constituency, how many companies there are, how many premises, how many jobs. So that you could invite people yourselves. And of course, we'll give you high quality social media collateral that you can use using our Serving Britain visual that you can see there. And we will continue to be a voice in the media. It is my fervent hope that by the 4th of July, you will have had enough of Kate Nicholls, because she will be everywhere on telly and on the radio making the case for you, as will be our members, and we regularly put members up as well. But we will apply the basic rule of communications that when you've had enough of your own voice, you've cut through. And then if I can just very quickly show the next slide. I also wanted to say this: we are everywhere you are, as well as the UK-wide team that Kate leads. We have specific colleagues in Scotland, in Wales. We work very closely with our colleagues at Hospitality Ulster. So all elections everywhere across the islands this year, we will be present on your behalf. So finally, on the next slide, look, we've talked about the politics, we've talked about the economics, we've talked about the policy and our approach, but we wanted to leave significant time for Q&A. Kate is a font of knowledge. I will hand over to David to chair a discussion. We have a good half hour now. So please, any questions that you have, Kate would be delighted to answer them.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks, Kate, for that. We've got some questions in, and please feel free to put some more in. I see they're now flooding in. First question. It felt like with the current government, there's been a bit of progress in recognition of the hospitality sector. Do we think that's lost? Do we think that will be rebuilt with Labour? What's your view on that?
Well, thank you for that, and for whoever put that question in. I don't think it will be lost, but I think we will have to work quite hard to make sure it's translated over. That's partly because the support for the hospitality sector, the awareness of the hospitality sector and its importance was brought to the fore during COVID. And the MPs that we worked really closely with, and I'm meaning more backbench MPs here, those sort of, you've got 650, there's a small proportion that are in the front bench that are at the nitty gritty of developing policy, but the backbench MPs, we have a cadre of about 350 who are active supporters of the hospitality and tourism sector and will table debates, ask questions, raise issues with both front benchers, and they are across party. So yes, the largest party was the Tory party, but we also worked really closely with all of the small parties in government, in Parliament. And as I say, we had a cadre of supportive MPs. Now, a large proportion of MPs are stepping down or their seats will change. So we do have to be able to make sure that we make the case again. And that's what Alan was talking about. That document is about making the case for why hospitality remains important. We can't just rely on going back to people, as we have been able to in this parliament, and say, you remember how much we were missed. The light and the life of the town centres were switched off during COVID. You remember how important we were. The economy went backwards when we weren't open, and it fired on all cylinders when we were open. We won't be able to do that in the new parliament, so we do have to make that case again. We are going to be publishing, as I say, the next iteration of our manifesto. We did our manifesto in the autumn. We put in place the changes we wanted. You've helped us to get that out as much as we can, and it is as much to do with your engagement with your local MPs that we have that positive set of supporters in Parliament championing our cause. It is very much to do with the letters you've written, so that will continue through the budget, the autumn statement. We now are setting out and publishing an agenda for change, an agenda for a new government, which will make the case again for why hospitality is a force for good, economically, socially, and culturally. And as Alan said, it's about that mantra that we create places people want to live, work, invest, and visit. So we'll need to do it again. On the government side, you have government ministers are a suite of civil servants, and that relationship continues and builds, and they just inherit that corporate history from their civil servants as they come in. The first day in the job is, here are the sort of key briefs on the sectors that are important to you, and these are the people you need to meet. And we've already had assurances from our 4 key departments, as well as the Treasury, that we are top of the list. You know, we are one of the biggest sectors of the economy, 3rd largest employer, 2nd largest export earner, and 10% of employment, 5% of GDP. We are top of the list for day one meetings with those key departments. So that will continue and move further forward. And on the opposition side, we've worked with those Labour policy teams for 12, 18, 24 months, for some of them all the way through the pandemic. They know us. We've provided them with expert advice, guidance, and support. This isn't a new relationship we're coming to. The one final point I would say, in all the conversations that I've had with the Labour Party over the last 2 years, their commentary is around the everyday economy, the foundation economy, the places people work, live, play, socialise in. And they see hospitality as key to that. And, you know, the last Labour conference and business days that were held in October, and then again in February, hospitality was mentioned by the front bench teams every single time they stood up. This is the everyday economy, which provides jobs for everybody everywhere. And it's not just because I'm sitting in the front row giving them a Paddington Bear stare that they're mentioning hospitality. I think it is genuinely felt, and it is leading with the fact that we employ 3.5 million people, and 40% of those are under the age of 24. That's what gives us that power and that draw, and is why we are listened to. So I think that will continue. I'm optimistic that will continue. I think they get us, they get the importance, and they want to work with us. So hopefully that provides reassurance. And as I say, this is not our first rodeo. It's not our first outing with the Labour Party. We've worked with them really closely in opposition.
Thanks, Kate. A bit of an election classic here. If you had only one question in the run-up to the general election, you could ask the current PM and Keir Starmer, what would it be for each?
Oh, goodness. That's a difficult one. I suppose, you know, for Keir Starmer, he talks about industrial strategy an awful lot. That's what we are going to see coming back. I would like to know and have the reassurance that all of that positive message that I've just talked about, will he include and embed hospitality as a key plank of the industrial strategy going forward, and give a commitment that that will be one of the priority areas. And for the current Prime Minister, would be what would he do to bring that to the fore and to make that the case? I mean, it's the same ask, but one has an industrial strategy that they're planning, that I want to see a guarantee, a cast iron guarantee, that the words everyday economy mean something, and everyday economy is the foundation of industrial strategy. And for the current Prime Minister is, will he commit to having an industrial strategy that includes hospitality and tourism? Alan, you probably have a different question.
No, I think that's right. I think there's a question. This isn't just for politicians, any of us who lead. It's always a good question to ask somebody, what do you want the thing you lead to look like when you leave? What is your goal? Like at a macro level, what do you want? And then understanding that, and perhaps with the Labour Party, their missions, their 5 missions do help us a bit, will let us know how we can be part of it. But to your point, Kate, I am absolutely clear that whoever is in power, the improvements to the communities across the UK we want to see, the improvements to people's life chances we want to see, the improvements to the UK economy that we want to see, hospitality has to be part of it. I might also ask here why he wears shirts which are darker than his jackets, but that's a personal taste.
Okay, well, if we're adding that in, we'd have to ask the Prime Minister why are his trousers so short? But
Yeah.
I think the key point, you're right. Hospitality is the key to delivering so much of what these politicians want to do. It's key to delivering the missions that the Labour Party has set out. The Tory party talks about their plan, and the plan is working. I'd like to see the plan, and I'd like to see hospitality at the heart of that.
Yes.
Both. A few questions grouped here on sort of the New Deal for working people. So I'll have 3 questions in one.
Okay.
The 12-week reference period, have we been making the point around seasonality to the Labour Party? There's reference in the latest document on tipping and Labour potentially going further than the current legislation. Do we think that Labour will go further in the short term? And the potential increase in sick pay from day one is a concern. Have we been having discussions with Labour on that policy?
Okay, I'll start, and then Alan, please come in on any of those that you want to see to comment on. I'm going to come in first because I'm going to spare Alan's blushes, but also Tony's blushes, who's not on the call today. But you know, the basic answer is what I started with at the start of this webinar. Of course, we've been having discussions. We've been having intense discussions. Alan and Tony and David have been working really hard over the course of the whole of the last year to be able to make sure that we are in a really strong position to be having productive, pragmatic, frank, behind closed doors discussions with those policy teams on how they are going to implement not just the New Deal for working people, but also the business rates policy and an apprenticeship levy. When you go into an election campaign, you only talk about headlines, and the parties only talk about headlines. We have done masses of work behind the scenes to get that detail shored up and worked through. And you know, all of those points that that are on those questions. Yes, we have been talking to them. Yes, we are making sure that they understand the way in which our business works. Civil servants, politicians will often be able to reference 9 to 5 office working or clocking in, clocking out. Our sector doesn't work like that. So we spent a great deal of time explaining to them how our sector works, and how we can help them to implement the policy in a way which meets their policy objective, but doesn't damage or disrupt unduly the business, add additional costs to the business, and crucially, doesn't get in the way of delivering what workers want. And that's the front line that we've been leading on. We provide flexible, variable hours, which is what workers want. So on those 3 points, just to take them in turn, seasonality. Alan has set out in the slides what we know is the published policy. That may well change. As we go forward, there is dialogue between the Labour Party and the unions and the business community, of which we are part, that will look at the sort of detail behind it. And the devil is always in the detail. At the moment, they are talking about a 12-week reference period, but they have reflected on seasonality, not just in our sector, but more broadly across the economy. And they have talked about potentially longer reference periods, or the ability to be able to go back and say at the end of a reference period that that reference period is atypical, doesn't work, or doesn't deliver hours that the worker wants. And the ability to, at the end of that period, say no, turn away from it, or do something different is the key bit that we are pushing to make sure that that remains workable. But yes, they understand the seasonality point, and we've referenced the Working Time Directive and the European Social Charter that does reflect seasonal working and allows a longer reference period. Tipping, going further than the legislation, as I say, the legislation's in place. So no, Labour has been pushing the government to say there's been too much delay. I think we will see ministers come straight back in and just push ahead with that 1st of October implementation date. But the legislation is now finalised, as is the draft code of practice. It is a final code of practice. It's in legislation. It was secured in the wash-up. They're not going to unpick it in the short term. Can't guarantee that any minister won't come back to legislation in the longer term and look at it, but we know whether the legislative framework is now. The only question mark remains over the 1st of October date, because that has to be enacted through another piece of legislation, but we anticipate that the minister will come in and just sign that off. And thirdly, sick pay from day one. Yes, that is a concern. We are talking to them. There's a very live debate at the moment as to what does day one really mean. And as Alan touched on, day one rights, they are talking about sensible, pragmatic probationary periods. And so it's how does day one right relate to a probationary period, that it goes to the heart of the matter. But as I say, we are extremely well placed to have that dialogue now. Have been influencing it over a period of time and will continue to influence it as it comes through. And once you get into power, obviously the civil service, and we have good relationships with the civil service, they will be the people who translate those policies into detail, and there will be consultation. And I think the final bit that the team has worked really hard to make sure we've got commitments on is that this will be subject to full and detailed, thorough consultation. So this is, while the legislation might be a commitment in the first 100 days, it won't be implemented within the first 100 days. And actually, a lot of that employment legislation has now been pushed back beyond the 100-day period. So that immediate threat of a new government coming in, day one rights from day one, dissipated, but we still do need to work really carefully to make sure that operationally the challenge is met. Alan, did you want to add anything on that?
No, I think to reinforce, if you take the tipping thing as an example, as you say, the law is the law. We can never predict exactly what the policy direction of a government across a term is, and I think it's an example of an area where we need to continue talking to them, understand what it is the principles they're trying to achieve are. But I think on that, and on other bits of their program, encourage them to watch the impact of the laws which are already there on something like tipping a new piece of law, understand how it operates before making further changes. One of the things that in conversation with Johnny Reynolds, the business secretary, last week, a point I made was the importance of certainty. There's nothing worse for a business than building a system and then having to unpick the system because politicians have changed their mind. And I think that's a key message.
I can see that we've got lots of questions, David, in the chat, and we've got sort of 15-20 minutes to run through them. So I think we probably ought to go for short, sharp answers. And I know there's a few there on business rates and broader issues than the employment law piece. So should we whiz through?
Yeah, I'll group a couple of tax ones in a minute. You've touched on the first 100 days of a Labour government. What do you think the highlights will be and things to watch out for in those 100 days?
I think first 100 days, and we're prioritising our asks as we've got out into first 100 days, first 100 weeks, the remainder of the Parliament, so that we're looking at those changes that you need to have. They will hit the ground running on the policies that they've announced so far and trailed quite extensively. So you will see an employment bill that will come through that will set the scene for the new deal for working people, but also crucially set the scene and give the changes to the apprenticeship levy. You will have a budget in the first 100 days. And the other big thing that you will have, I think you will have a period of pause because of the timing of the election. You've got a massive, two very big foreign policy initiatives that are happening within the first week of a government. So you've got the NATO summit and you've got the European cooperation. So I think that will start to set the scene. And I mention those because it means that they are going to be preoccupied in setting the scene for Great Britain and doing that positive agenda for change. If you've got it coming in, either party coming in will use those to talk about Britain's global position and to start talking economic narrative up, which is positive from an operational perspective. But it means they're going to be quite preoccupied, and therefore the sort of back end of the first 100 days is when you're likely to see the budget and the King's speech coming through in the normal range of things in around September. But those are the two big ones we'll be watching out for. Budget clearly significant because of what it means for business rates and what it means for national living wage.
Great segue there, thank you. So business rates review, what sort of timescale do you think that will work to? Labour are talking about VAT changes for private schools. Do you think there's scope for changes within hospitality? And a third tax question on local tourist taxes that have come in a few areas, and that increasing the overall tax bill.
Yeah, I'll start on business rates, and perhaps Alan, you might want to pick up on the tourism taxes and what you're getting from Labour about where they might look at in that respect. I think our sense is that you'll have two bites of the cherry around business rates review. The commitment from the Labour Party in the pre-briefing documents before the manifesto, we wait to see what gets translated into the manifesto, is around a root and branch reform of business rates to reset and rebalance between high streets and online. And that would be economy wide. What we're anticipating from the conversations we've had is that you'd have two stages to that. One would be some immediate changes that they could do potentially in the first budget or potentially in the next revaluation period around business rates reform. That could address the cliff edge that you've got in April 2025, and then a longer term project. So they know and understand if you're going to rip it up for the whole economy, that needs a much bigger period of time to take that through. And you're probably looking at a couple of years, so middle of the Parliament, to try and get that underway. So what we're anticipating is that they'll do some quick and immediate wins that they can get for the 20% of the economy for whom business rates doesn't work, retail and hospitality, and then look at more detailed reform as you go further forward, particularly aligning it to the 2026 to 2030 revaluation period if you're looking at making big changes. So they have got some announcements that they've already trailed around smoothing out that small business rate relief when you go from 1 to 2 and multiple premises. And they've also made some first budget that could be delivered within a finance bill, and it could be delivered within the first budget, and then you could do longer reform, but it would take primary legislation. So that's where you're looking at that starting in 2025-26. On the VAT for private schools, I think the other big issue this week, you've seen declarations from both parties that they won't increase the headline rate of VAT. Both been very careful to talk about the headline rate, but I think setting those quadruple locks both on pensions and on tax rises gives very little room for manoeuvre, and I'm increasingly nervous around business taxes as to where you fill that shortfall, and indirect taxes. I can't see any cuts coming in the short term, but that doesn't mean to say we can't revisit that in the longer term. But I think, you know, being realistic, the prospect of an immediate or early cut in VAT or an early cut in other taxes is not realistic. Alan, do you want to take the tourism tax one?
Yeah, absolutely. And pick up where we left off, where you left off, really, that there have been some very big, significant spending, well, yeah, spending commitments by the parties which have fiscal implications they need to pick up elsewhere. The areas in the country where we have visitor levies are include Labour areas, you know, the Welsh experience, what's happening in Manchester as examples. The idea of a visitor levy is attractive to devolved administrations, and also perhaps to the Labour Party, whether or not it's to reinvest in tourism development or whether it's to pay for perceived negative externalities from tourism. So I think it is likely to be a live conversation in the next Parliament. We will need to continue to make the case as to what that would mean for the sector, and in particular, make sure that it wouldn't be seen as an easy way of filling the fiscal hole that the other decisions that you've just described might leave. So I think, yes, this is going to be a very live conversation that we're going to need to be significantly part of. And not just in Westminster, but also, of course, in Wales and Scotland as they implement, and at local level in places like Manchester, Birmingham, and London as well. Kate, I know that you've been very close to many of these conversations, particularly with the devolved government, and you know, as I do, that there are relatively few levers people can pull, and a tax on tourism cannot be used to replace the lost local government funding and in effect pay for bins. So
Yeah.
this is going to be a live conversation, and one that we're going to need to be close to over the next 18 months to 2 years in particular, I think.
Yeah, but at the moment, the message we're getting from Rachel Reese's team is no plans for a legislation to impose a tourism tax. Although the siren voices are calling for one, I think what we would urge is members on the ground, if you hear that being talked about at a local level, please let us know, and we can help to push back on that as appropriate. Or let us know if you're wanting to support it, and we can manage that process too. Our view is that a bid is much better. I can see we've still got some questions.
Yep. So a couple on campaigning. You've mentioned support materials for members. What do we have in place to share with businesses so they can contact candidates and be well informed? And a second question related to that is some of the operators on the ground are pushing back about hosting candidate visits or meetings. Is there any guidance or help we can provide there?
Yes, so that takes us neatly into our next steps as a result of this webinar. We will be having a series of webinars that follow on this, and we'll also have a series of publications. So the guidance and briefings and parliamentary data is being refreshed and uploaded as we speak, so it'll be on the website. You will have early next week a 2-page briefing that has your standard infographic, the headline stats on the sector and its contribution at a global UK level on one side, and a narrative on the other side of key messages, key asks, and what we're doing, what we're wanting to get out of any briefings or letters. There will also be the tool in place to allow you to get constituency data for where the site is located, so that you've got actual data that breaks it down for locally, what does it mean, and also an ability to write to the MPs and sorry, not the MPs, to write to all of the candidates, and that will be freely available. So hopefully that gives everybody the tools and the information they need to be able to do it. What would be really helpful, if you don't want to host visits, you don't need to. People often can feel uncomfortable about it, and we fully understand that, but at the very least helpful to have the local letters to go out to the candidates, to be able to raise awareness of the importance of the sector as a local employer, and the social and cultural value that we have and community value that we have. So writing is just as good as hosting a visit. For those who do want to host visits, we will be there and can help support as necessary with those visits if people are feeling particularly nervous about it and don't want to. Or the other alternative is to talk to businesses in the area, and we can host a sort of mini roundtable hustings so that it's not just individualized to one site. It is sort of hoteliers or pubs and bars and restaurants in an area. We can host a visit for the candidates. And this is not about party political campaigning or lobbying. This is not about making a specific ask as we did at the budget. This is about introducing them to hospitality and asking them for their support for the sector as a whole. But people should only do as much or as little as they feel comfortable with. We will be doing the whole thing, and we will be writing out to all PPCs, and then we will pick up with members of Parliament afterwards and after the election has concluded. So we will be doing that, but this is just about softening them up and getting that calling card out and responding to requests for further information. So if anybody does have any nervousness or picking it up, hopefully the guide we will be producing next week will answer those questions. We'll give them that information and support, but people should only do what they feel comfortable with. I think that's everything around that we've got. And I know there's one final question that's related to that around the vacancies in constituency seats, likely lack of candidates. We are focusing our attention on the main parties, the two main parties in particular, but areas where they are standing other candidates, the Lib Dems, but obviously Scotland and Wales in particular, also the main parties in those parts of the devolved administrations. But those vacancies will be filled. All the main parties will have candidates fielding, and they'll be finished this week. So we will be writing out to all the prospective parliamentary candidates to be able to make sure that they know and understand our concerns, and working and prioritising resources at the most important seats for us, where there is a density of hospitality and tourism venues, and also prioritising talking to the two main parties at the top on policy levels. What we will be doing then is making sure we've got a further webinar following up when the manifestos are launched, likely next weekend. So probably a fortnight's time, we'll do one that analyses and does the corporate risk assessment, gives you an update on where we are in campaigning and talking to the parties, and the outreach that we are doing. And then most importantly, good to end as well on the fact that we have our conference coming up on the 13th of June in London. So we would urge people, contact us if you haven't yet booked a ticket, but we have front bench speakers from the two main parties, Shadow Cabinet and Cabinet Minister, coming to speak at our conference. You'll appreciate, for security reasons, we can't announce names, but they are the very top level. So if you've got questions or issues you want raised with those two main parties, that is our hustings at our summer conference. So do contact the team if you haven't got a ticket yet and want to attend.
And we will send an email immediately after this to all everyone who's on this call with the details on how they can sign up, Kate.
Great. I think we've covered all the questions. Hopefully that's given you a useful insight to the science of psephology, which keeps Alan, David and I and Tony very occupied. We love it, and we are happy to share that with as many of you as want. If you've got follow-up questions or you want to ask the updates, we will provide those to you, and we will be monitoring closely what happens as we go through the election period. We get closer to election day, we can predict what's happening with those seats, and make sure that we hit the ground running so that our first 100 days of a new parliament are as productive and effective as they can be on your behalf. Many thanks.